The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the podcast belong solely to the hosts and not the host's past, present, or future employers. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It is Brian, Ms. Berlin, and Mr. Betcher for Breaking Down Security.
Hello.
So,
all right. So we're going to do something a little different. We're going to cut out all the small talk because our person...
Not all of it.
Well,
all right, maybe. Okay, fine,
a
whatever.
little bit, yeah. Well, we're on a timetable today, and we have very important people on, and I don't mean that facetiously. This person, probably the highest ranking person in an organization we've ever had. She owns a company, and it's a long time in coming, and I'm very nervous. I fanboyed out. I was telling Ms. Berlin, Mr. Betcher, picked a bad.
He was
day to
very
put
nervous
forward.
earlier.
I
Like, why? It's just Katie. She's great.
You ruined the spoiler alert.
Did you want? You wanted intro.
No,
Sorry.
no, you go now. You go now. It's fine. I don't want to do it now. I want to do it now. Whatever. Anyway, so it's not just Katie. It's Katie Moussouris. I mean, she's on the show.
The Katie.
I mean, this is 4 years in coming. We've made all of our sacrifices to the PR and marketing gods, and sacrificed chickens and stuff, and boom, we got her finally. 4 years. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And you know that really all it takes is just one pink chicken. You could have saved so many non-pink chickens' lives if you just sacrificed the pink one. Then we would have been in business.
That would have been great. I've eaten a lot of those pink chickens, but they make me sick after a while. I had them for the little marshmallow ones.
Yeah, just one peep. One peep is what I was asking for. That's it.
Damn. Yeah,
I thought I read something saying that peeps weren't a thing this year, but so like a marshmallow shortage or something, but that's all right.
Very cool. All right. So, just to for the one person who's been living under a rock, Katie, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to where you are, your superhero story, if you will?
Oh, I thought we were time limited. No. Okay. So I will tell you, I am the founder and CEO of my own company, as you mentioned, LutaSecurity, and Luta is named after the nickname for the island where my mom was born in the Pacific. It's the tiniest little island just north of Guam. And the locals call it Luta based on a mispronunciation by the Japanese occupiers of the actual name of the island, which is Rota, R-O-T-A. So anyway, that's the origin story of LutaSecurity, the company. I started about 4.5 years ago, right after launching Hack the Pentagon, which was the very first bug bounty program of the United States Department of Defense. And it was after many years of consulting with them, all the way back from when I used to work at Microsoft, when I had launched Microsoft's first bug bounty programs, which my little baby bug bounty grew. Last year, I heard Microsoft paid out over $14 million in that bug bounty, which is kind of amazing. Especially considering back when I first joined Microsoft, the executives had publicly sworn that they would never pay hackers for vulnerability information. So in my own career before that, I was a hacker, professional hacker, a penetration tester is what we call ourselves. The joke is still funny 20 years later. And I spent a lot of time breaking into places for money. And so I got bored of doing that work myself because, frankly, most organizations weren't getting that much better. They were not maturing in their security. And frankly, we could have just changed the date on the report most of the time. We were going back to clients because they were taking our reports and they were checking a box for compliance that they had a security test. And they weren't really learning any lessons from it. So I got sick of that, joined Microsoft as a strategist, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that pretty much brings us up to present day, unless you want to go all the way back to my origins in musical theater and my penchant for the Rocky Horror Picture Show. But I think that's for later, maybe the outtake version of this podcast.
Yeah, we'll do the time warp later on. Yeah,
that's
cool. So the first time I wanted to have you on was at Microsoft, and obviously the PR weasels there wouldn't let me have you on the show. You've done a lot of vulnerability, security, and disclosure, working with the big companies out there. And the reason we wanted you on was because you've developed your own maturity model, which I think is great. It's called the Vulnerability Coordination Maturity Model. There's a link in the show notes, lutasecurity.com/VCMM, Victor, Charlie, Mike. I found it very simple and easy to use. I would imagine a lot of organizations would find it very difficult to use. Can we maybe talk about how you came about the coordination model and why these 5 facets were important?
Sure. Well, I mean, as I mentioned, I was a professional penetration tester. And before that, I was a professional developer. I was a Linux developer. And I worked on an operating system back in, the late 90s, early 2000s. And I started the Linux company's vulnerability response, meaning monitoring the world for vulnerabilities that could affect our products, testing any kind of security issues that were surfaced in the world. And since I was a developer, I was actually writing the patches myself and then testing the patches and then putting them up for our customers to download. And I started writing the advisories and releasing. So I knew from, an open source, very much grassroots kind of engineer-led effort, all the way up to what it takes to respond to vulnerabilities at the scale of Microsoft, which is the opposite of a tiny little Linux distro, right? So you've got specialization in roles and all kinds of complexity and everything, but the behaviors that meant that organizations were going to be able to handle what came at them, those behaviors is what went into the 5 capability areas of the VCMM, the maturity model for vuln coordination. Because I observed that if they do these things, one, they can benchmark themselves as to what are they capable of right now in terms of their resources, their activities that they do. How are they learning from their mistakes? Like every bug is an opportunity. How are they incorporating that? How are they communicating? Not just to the hackers who are reporting issues to them, but also to different audiences, right? A hacker is going to want very different information than members of the press and consumers, so you have to pay attention to all of these different facets. And what I found was, in my experience, of doing all of these different roles in security, that the common threads distilled down to these 5 capability areas. And that's what I use it with my clients as a tool, and Luta's customers as a tool to orient themselves around what they need to do to just at the basic level respond to vulnerability reports, and then how they can improve, and not just improve their vulnerability response, but actually improve their security, which allegedly was the goal in the first place, right? You shouldn't just be sitting there waiting for the bugs to roll in and play whack-a-bug the entire time. You should actually have a plan and make sure that, one, that process is running smoothly, and 2, you're getting more out of that process than just those one individual bugs at a time. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
All right. So, Mr. Betcher, Ms. Berlin, please feel free to join us.
So, Katie, you talked about behaviors of people. I mean, are big or small companies, are these behaviors, can you expand upon what these behaviors are and are they universal?
So I wrote the maturity model specifically to, with that range of personas in mind, of looking back at my own career. If you're an organization and you've got a scrappy engineer who wants to branch out and take over in securing the product, then this maturity model can work for an organization like that, because it worked for me when I was that scrappy engineer in that Linux distro. It can also work if you're actually a mega corporation like a Microsoft or a Google or whatnot, who have not only higher capabilities in a lot of areas, but it's a way to direct those capabilities that makes it much more powerful. So for example, at the expert level, in some of these capability areas, you really would only need to get to that level if you were a very large organization. And 2, that, the capabilities such as telemetry, right? The ability to detect crashes in the wild, that ability is something that can change your behavior in real time during your vulnerability response process. So somebody reports a bug to you, if you are a large enough organization that you have the capability of checking the telemetry of the world and seeing if there's evidence of exploitation in the wild, you might change the priority of fixing that issue. That's a level of maturity that only certain of the largest organizations, one, even need, and two, are even capable of. So if that makes sense, there's a whole range there just caught up in those 3 levels of maturity in the 5 capability areas.
Cool. Ms. Berlin?
Now, earlier you mentioned not playing whack-a-mole, right? When it comes to those vulns coming in, like I'm assuming that happens a lot when people try and roll it out in the beginning, right? What are some of the things that you can do to prevent that from happening? So you're not just, I feel like, not ever having implemented one myself, you could just be running around like crazy being like, oh my God, I have to fix this and I have to fix this. And now what are we doing? I'm assuming some panic that goes along with that if you don't follow a model.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, because bug bounties, especially, and even vuln disclosure programs, but really bug bounties have gained sort of a celebrity status all unto themselves, right? That a lot of organizations are fooled by the rhetoric that they can just start a bug bounty as their first step, or if they're nervous about it, maybe don't offer money and just start a vuln disclosure program, a VDP, as their first step in security. And so what we've seen over the past 4.5 years of this kind of harmful marketing getting out there into the world is that we arrive at organizations and they'll say, we started a bug bounty program. We didn't know what we were doing. We now have this epic pile of bugs. And I asked them, okay, so, let's talk to your security people. And they're like, oh, we don't have any security people. No, we just give them to the engineers. And I'm like, okay, well, the engineers did write those bugs in the first place. They might need a little more help from security experts in how to fix these bugs comprehensively. But essentially, we're looking at organizations that if they are smart, they will have taken their existing bug patching process. So when they're doing their own scanning and anticipated that they're going to have an increased need for capacity in some of these areas because suddenly you're receiving bug reports, in an uncontrolled fashion from the public. The organizations that suffer are the ones that, one, didn't think to actually have security people on the inside, right? To help translate to the engineers how to fix these issues or to fully comprehend them. And the organizations that also don't do very well in these scenarios are ones where they thought that they could completely outsource this process, that it's managed for them, and therefore what their response is, whether they take a long time to fix bugs or never fix them at all, they're expecting their bug bounty company to manage that for them. And that's where we've seen a lot of problems kind of falling out of the existing bug bounty implementations and bug bounty industry in the world today.
Okay.
Sounds like a potential nightmare.
It has been a nightmare to watch because it's so preventable.
There's a way to do it correctly. If you think about it and plan it, which I feel like probably there's a lot of things that go into production like that.
Exactly. Which, the bizarre thing that occurred recently in vuln disclosure guidance is, CISA, DHS CISA put out VDP guidance because they put out a binding operational directive and they said every single federal agency and government entity needs to have a vuln disclosure program. And they put deadlines in there. And actually a deadline is coming up. I think it's this Friday or maybe it's next Friday, something like that. But it is where they have to, step one, identify a point of contact to report vulnerabilities. Why on earth would that be the step one? There is nothing in the guidance about, by the way, you should not only scan yourselves first and just make sure you've patched the obvious,
right?
But two, have some sort of operational capacity to deal with this influx. And so VDP guidance came out from CISA, which is out of order in terms of what makes a successful program. They're like, step one, identify a point of contact. Step two, identify the targets in scope. I'm like, oh my God, everyone's going to die this way. And what's bizarre is that the United States government itself did not roll into a vuln disclosure program in that manner. I know because I rolled them into it. So I'm kind of like, guys, you kind of forget what happened like 5, 6, 7 years ago when I first started coming by. This
And
is
that
a
poor-
process,
That
right?
poor guy in the help desk that they're assigning as the point of
Exactly.
contact is screwed.
He's screwed, right? And it's going to be by department by department. And what's crazy about it is they know that this is going to be painful, but they're expecting the pain to be somehow transformative. And I'm like, why, when we have a model that you in fact used, would we go through this? And then similarly, the UK government has just also issued VDP guidance. And they say it in there as they acknowledge a little bit better that, oh yes, we'll be releasing some guidance for what you need to do internally too, but that'll come later. And I'm like, so you're going to basically invite everyone to a picnic where you've offered them delicious barbecue. And you're like, I'm just going to figure out how to have a barbecue later. You know what I mean? But everyone's going to be there and expecting barbecue, right? So how are you going to barbecue those bugs? You don't have a smoker. You don't have any spice rub, So the whole thing that I look at is it would make sense if this were 7 years ago and people were new to this and everything, and the ISO standards for governing these things, these processes, internal and external, weren't out, which, as you know, I'm a co-editor of these ISO standards. All of these like weird sort of out of order guidance would have made sense before all of that. But now it just seems like everyone is willing to jump into a Vuln Disclosure program or a bug bounty program like they're going to jump into a marathon from the couch. And I'm like, you're going to hurt yourselves, So I'm afraid for our friends who have gone from couch to VDP in 30 seconds, but hopefully they'll do some stretching,
Yeah. I work, I have seen what happens when a customer asks if a company has a VDP program, and they're like, oh yeah, we have a security ad or a bugs ad or whatever, and then they bury that email address down in 8 pages of terms and conditions. It's a nightmare, and they're obviously not ready for that disclosure when it comes across the wire. So. All right, so I have another question here. You have co-authored a lot of the ISO standards for this, and you mentioned that the government's also rolling this out. The government are the ISO docs required for this to work, or will they assist in an easier outcome? Is NIST using some guidelines from the ISO standards to kind of tailor what's going on in the government? What does that look like? And again, with the ISO docs, are these just guidelines, or is there a NIST one? Let's say I'm not in the UK or in the US and I want to use something else.
Well, okay. So the ISO docs are pretty useful. A lot of people had complained about them not being free and not understanding that ISO is a business, I guess, that has a business model. I don't make any money from these ISO docs selling. So, but no, to answer your first question, are they required? No, they're not required. However, more and more organizations, NIST, you mentioned, does actually refer to them and says that you should have a process, for receiving vulnerability reports and processing them, which refers to the ISO standards. And in fact, the NIST cybersecurity framework is, you have to follow that if you are a vendor to the US government. So in fact, even if it's not a hard requirement per se, you'll be asked at this point as a vendor to the U.S. government if you follow the NIST guidelines, which do contain references to the ISO standards. The NIST also has put out some guidance because NIST worked on a multi-stakeholder sort of working group event where, because the ISO standards were not free, they were saying, well, we need free guidance. And I was like, yeah, but the ISO standards are not that expensive. And frankly, if an organization is balking at paying a grand total of $199 for both of those standards, I'm going to go ahead and posit that organization is probably going to have a bad time responding to bug reports. I'm just going to say it right there. So NIST went ahead and did this anyway. I participated in that as well, especially around awareness and adoption of the existing standards, because a lot of people didn't know about them. But if folks are really feeling like they can't afford $199, there is a video that I recorded at RSA that's 20 minutes long, and it goes into both of the standards. and what you need to set that up. So, if you Google RSA, ISO standards and my last name, you'll find that video. So there you go, free of charge.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I looked them up online, and it was in some kind of CHF, which I found out was like Swiss francs, and that's like bars of chocolate or something. Anyway, so there's links at the bottom of the show notes for all of the ISO standards. They're like 150, 150, and 95, because those were the three that were mentioned in the slide prezos. So how well does this scale? If you're a large organization, can you use it in an interdepartmental method? If you have a red team, can you use this as a way of helping the red team report bugs to your internal organization, and then branch out from that? How does this work at scale? If I'm a 2-person company versus a 20,000 person company.
Well, okay. So are you asking about the ISO standards or the vuln coordination maturity model at this point?
The VCMM, yeah.
Okay. So the VCMM, you can absolutely meet the basic level of maturity in a VCMM with a very tiny organization. Actually, the first organization that I showed this to was the FDA. And FDA, among all federal agencies, outside of the DoD, are very, very forward thinking when it comes to engaging with security researchers. They were among the very first to, it was actually Dr. Suzanne Schwartz, who I admire very, very much as being one of the biggest leaders of the US federal government in embracing security research. She would hold symposiums where she'd invite medical device manufacturers, hackers, policy folks, all kinds of folks. And she really broke down barriers. But what's important was when I showed the VCMM to the FDA, she was very much like, you know what, this will work even for the small, innovative medical device manufacturers, which can often be a 7-person team with no actual engineers on board. It's physicians and research scientists, and they have an idea for a device, and they design what it is that they want the device to do, and then they outsource the creation of the actual device. So whoever built the device chose the hardware, implemented the firmware, wrote the software, isn't working at that tiny little innovative medical device startup, probably. And it surprised me in that she said that this would actually be useful to even that scenario. And one of the key things that she wanted to strike a balance of, and I think, regulators like her that regulate an industry should be aware of this, is that she didn't want to make the requirements for handling vulnerabilities so high that most organizations would just try and cut themselves off and never hear about a bug, right? In order to never have to deal with it. She also myth busted a lot with organizations and medical device manufacturers, saying that you can still patch a security bug and still maintain your FDA certification. You don't have to go through a recertification process. You can get a temporary, like it's still certified, as long as it's not changing the functionality of the medical device. So she myth busted to be able to facilitate this engagement and increase the maturity of even the smallest vendors in that space, which I thought was great.
That's cool. Yeah, the medical establishment likes to use the fact that we can't patch because we'll lose our FDA. Seems like been an
I remember arguing with manufacturers when I worked at the hospital because we had a questionnaire that we had to give them. We're like, yeah, are you up to date on this, and this? I'm like, oh, we have to remain at this patch level because the FDA. Nope. Here's the documentation.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think, if we think about the ISO standards themselves, right, this ISO standards take years to create because you're basically writing a document by committee, and it's by international committee, which is even harder and everything. And you only get to meet every 6 months, right, by ISO rules. So, minimum to get an ISO standard published is usually averages about 5 years. So we went through that process and everything, and it actually took longer than that from the, the instigation of the study period, which occurred before I was even at Microsoft, It was Canadians, by the way. We can blame Canada for starting that. But by the time I got involved in everything, it took another, I think, 7 years after that. So it took 9 years for that ISO standard to be released. It was started in 2005 by the Canadians as the responsible disclosure standard, and it was trying to regulate actually what hackers should do in disclosure. And so I put a stop to that when I became,
Wow.
the US expert. Oh yeah. Oh, those ISO standards would have been quite a different picture if I hadn't, if it weren't for me meddling with it and then eventually taking over. Because really, who follows ISO standards? I don't know any hackers who do, but I know corporations and governments who do. So we changed the focus to this is what a corporation or a government or any entity that wants to receive bugs should be able to do. One important point about the two ISO standards, though, and not many people understand this, is that to say that you're compliant with both of them, okay, you have to not just have a front door and easy way to get in contact and responsive and all that stuff, because that's all in ISO 29147, which is vulnerability disclosure. You actually have to have everything going on in ISO 30111, which is vulnerability handling processes. That is the internal. So think of it like ISO 29147 vulnerability disclosure is like the mouth of the organism. 30111 is a digestive system where all the action happens, and then back out through 29147 out the other end. So it is, if it were an organism, that is how it works. So can an organism function with just a mouth and the other end and no digestive system? No, it cannot, right? So 30111, that internal vulnerability handling process, that is absolutely required if you are to say that you comply with the other one, the Vuln Disclosure one. But you don't need the Vuln Disclosure one to actually have internal vulnerability handling processes. Ideally, every organization does, right? It's scanning your systems, applying patches, figuring out if you write code, what you said about the red team, internal red team, if you find something, you have to have a way to process and handle all of those types of things that it doesn't matter who gave you that bug or who made you aware of it. If it's your internal teams, if it's a business partner, if it's a hacker, none of it matters of the source of it. It's just 30111 is the guts of it. So that is where your action will take place in digesting and dealing with that bug. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
if you were really poor and could not afford Vuln Disclosure and vulnerability handling process standards, I would definitely buy ISO 30111 before you buy ISO 29147.
Cool. Okay. So I'm a CEO of a company or a startup, and I have this cool new product, and we're going to launch it next week. And I come to Katie and I say, Katie, we want to have a vulnerability disclosure process for a product that launches next week. What are you going to tell them? Is that is that realistic to be able to do that? And can we talk a little bit about who the stakeholders would be involved with this, and how long it would take to actually implement this properly?
Well, it really depends on what they're doing for security response right now. So I would start to ask them, so how long does it normally take you to patch issues that you know about through your existing means, right? And if they stare at me with this blank stare of, no, we want to start a VDP to find out about the bugs, then I basically have to have a very hard conversation with them about the fact that they can't handle the truth. If this is their very first security test, this is a terrible idea. And actually their product probably shouldn't launch right now, or, they risk having a very insecure product. And you'd be surprised at how many organizations still come to security companies asking for a magic after the fact bullet like that. But if they have had more reasonable expectations of themselves and have invested in security somewhat, then that's where it's a matter of me gauging, essentially what are the capabilities that they have right now? Do they have any internal folks with particular security knowledge? Because even if you have an outsourced program and you have someone who is validating that those bugs are real and then throwing them over the fence to your engineers, if your engineers are not security minded, they will absolutely make the problem worse, right? So a lot of the things I ask is about current engineering secure development practices. You think, what does secure development have to do with the Vuln Disclosure program? Everything. It has everything to do with the Vuln Disclosure program. And if you're skipping all of that and saying, no, we need to learn about the bugs so then we can start thinking about security, I got to tell you, it is backwards and it's very inefficient. You will waste, especially if you're a tiny company, you will absolutely waste time, money, and effort if your first foray into security as a tiny company is a Vuln Disclosure program. We used to say you can't pen test your way to secure, right? When penetration testing was the main, checkbox that people were saying, no, we invited security experts to test our product. They spent 2 whole weeks on it. Look at that. It's secure now. You can't pen test your way to secure. You can't Vuln Disclosure program or bug bounty your way to secure either. It's the same concept. It's testing after you've already developed everything. So I absolutely ask a lot of questions about their existing remediation capability and their existing secure development lifecycle knowledge and capability. Because, oftentimes I will actually, refer them to partners of LutaSecurity to get them some better help that is more efficient and it's earlier in their dev life cycle and will help them make huge mistakes of going out in public with an untested product with no security personnel internally to fix what is found when it's broken.
Okay.
Katie, a related question. Put yourself in the shoes of one of our listeners, security person. Maybe they've got a CISSP. They're at, maybe they've been in the industry for a year or two. They work for a company that has potentially vulnerable systems out there, yet they don't have a VDP. Can you give them your best elevator pitch as to why they need one?
Well, I wouldn't. That's the whole thing, is that if they are at a place where they've got vulnerable systems out there and no VDP, it's not the lack of VDP that led to them having vulnerable systems out there. Do you see what I'm saying? So I would not advise them to say, okay, well, we know we have vulnerable systems, so therefore we should start a VDP. We think we have vulnerable systems. To answer that question, we should either scan for those vulnerable systems ourselves, hire experts to scan for them if we cannot, and then assess, sort of gauge where we are, right? But I absolutely would not be telling someone that if you think you're vulnerable and you don't know, step 1 is go out and start a VDP so someone can tell you, so some stranger can tell you about it. It's the reason why it's taken so long for even, the Forbes Global 2000, for all of them to have a point of contact, like a security @ email address or anything, is because of that digestive system. The large organizations all know how much time and effort that would take to really implement properly. So they don't even put a front door out there. They're like, you've just got to play, LinkedIn, Twitter bingo game to find a point of contact, right? So they don't even put it out there because they know. Right? So a small organization, I would never advise them to stumble face first into a VDP if they're wondering about what vulnerabilities are out there. That is their cue to hire some experts, ideally ones that work for you full time so that you can prevent those things from happening, or have your own, sort of running continually security scans to alert you if something pops up. But if they don't have that, substituting it with a Vuln Disclosure program is like, it's like saying, I'm going to build my entire house. I'm not going to consult with any kind of architects or structural safety experts whatsoever. And then I'm just going to invite a bunch of strangers on the street to shake my house. Like, it's insane, right? So you'd go in the opposite order. I feel like the marketing, of VDPs as a reasonable first step was the bug bounty companies realizing that this is ridiculous, and that, most organizations can't be offering cash for this kind of abuse, where they've not done any kind of security work on their own, and suddenly now they're offering cash rewards to shake their house, by a bunch of strangers. The bug bounty companies realized that a couple of years ago that was ridiculous. So then they started pushing, well, a VDP is a really good first step. You should do a VDP as a first step. And it is not a first step. It is not even close.
That was our show for this week. You can find show notes for this and all of our shows at www.breakingsecurity.com. You can also find an RSS link on the site to add to your favorite podcatcher. You can find all of us on Twitter. Miss Berlin can be found at InfoSyster, INFOSYSTIR. Mr. Betcher can be found at BetcherPwned, BOETTCHERPWNED. And you can follow me on Twitter at Brian Brake, BRYANBRAKE. We have a Slack. Come join us on our Slack. A lot of great things going on there, a lot of channels of various InfoSec-related subjects. You can get an invite on Twitter by emailing our official Twitter handle for the show at Brakesec, BRAKESEC, or you can email us at bds.podcast@gmail.com. Thank you to all of our Patreon supporters for their monetary assistance by offsetting costs involved in putting out a weekly show. Zoom fees, Libsyn hosting, domain purchase, renewal, equipment upgrades, time and effort building the community we have. We appreciate all of your help and support. If you'd like a t-shirt, stickers, coffee mug, or just to show your support for the show, you can check out our TPub site, www.tpublic.com/user/BDS podcast. We thrive on your feedback. A quick 5-star comment on iTunes or Google Play Store or your favorite streaming service, Spotify, Pandora, what have you, go a long way to gaining us additional visibility. It takes no time at all, and we appreciate your help in spreading the word. That was it for Breaking Down Security this week. Be safe, be well, be kind to one another, take care of yourself because you're the only you have, and we'll talk to you again soon.